Okay, so good evening, everyone. I want to start by thanking all of you for attending this talk in person and on Zoom to learn more about the research that I worked on during my dissertation. And I'm going to share a presentation here, give some of my results and findings and some ideas for next steps moving forward with work as it relates to the island. And then I'll kind of open it up for any feedback or questions that you may have. So I'm going to share my screen. So give me a moment to do that. Can you all see the title slide there?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So again, thank you all for having me here today. And it's my hope to come back to the island in person soon to discuss new directions and to just reunite with some of my favorite people. So for those of you who aren't already familiar with my work, I wanted to briefly introduce myself and my background. So my name is Andreana Cunningham, but I go by Andree for short. And I'm an assistant professor at Boston University in anthropology, archaeology, and African American and Black diaspora studies. But at the time that I was in St Helena, I was a PhD student working on my dissertation project. So in terms of my research, I'm an anthropologist who uses interdisciplinary approaches to study slave trade migration. And my research uses unconventional records to fill in the gaps that we see in historical data. And I do this to get a broader understanding of how enslaved people navigated the spaces that they were brought to. And further, my work explores how we define the African diaspora, and it asks how we might reframe it to more accurately capture the range of diversity that we see in slave trade contexts. So today I'll be presenting on my dissertation research, and my dissertation was titled Reframing Diaspora, Southeastern African Contributions to Biosocial Variation in Atlantic-Afro-Descendant Groups. Sorry, that's a mouthful. So my dissertation used skeletal and archival data to analyze patterns of biological and social diversity across sites of the slave trade. So I'll first give some background on slave trade migration history and the African diaspora. I'll also provide some details of the actual activities that I did while I was in St. Helena last year. And lastly, I'll discuss 2 chapters of my dissertation. The first study looks at patterns of biological diversity at 4 enslavement sites, one of which includes St. Helena. And the second study focuses on what archival resources can tell us about experiences of slavery in its late stages. And then I'll wrap up with some discussion of my future projects. So I'll start with some background on slave trade migration history. So the African diaspora refers to the forced displacement of millions of Africans and their descendants across the globe due to colonial slave trading. The most well part of this trade is known as the transatlantic slave trade or Middle Passage, which included upwards of 12 million people of African descent. The scope and magnitude of the African diaspora is unprecedented as a mass migration network. A big challenge in studying the slave trade is the gaps in migration historical data. The complexity of migration routes, as well as the frequently undocumented journeys that slave ships took, have made it difficult to identify the origins of the enslaved. For example, the transatlantic slave trade overlapped in region and time period with the Indian Ocean slave trade, which is a multi-directional slave trade between Africa and Asia. So these intersections in migration raise questions about identity, as the Indian Ocean slave trade included Asian as well as African people captured into slavery. And this is something we see represented in places like St. Helena and South Africa. Another challenge is the lack of records from enslaved persons' perspectives. So there are, of course, valuable slave narratives that give us this insight, but these are far outnumbered by documents that express enslaved persons as numbers or as collectives, such as what you would see in ship manifest records or plantation records. And lastly, many Afro-descendants are seeking answers about their ancestry. Genetic ancestry testing has rapidly expanded over the past couple decades, and Black Americans and also Saints have had increasing interest in using these types of services. So these gaps that we see in migration data matter because they directly obstruct the ability of Afro-descendants to meaningfully connect with their past. And so the main takeaway here is that the slave trade has made it difficult to recover these important stories about the past. So I'd like to expand a bit on my first point about these gaps that we're seeing in slave trade history. It's also a challenge to understand how and to what extent these complex migration networks of the slave trade overlaps. Can you see this video playing of migration networks? Great. So this video shows the estimated migrations of slave trade ships transporting enslaved Africans over time. And I started at the year 1700 because this is when you start seeing an increase in slave trade spread and complexity. So when we think about the slave trade, we usually imagine the Middle Passage, which was transporting upwards of 12 million Africans of mainly West African descent to the Americas. However, there was also much movement within the African continent during this period due to the unrest of the slave trade. So for example, you can see that some West Africans here are moving southward towards the Cape and Southeastern African regions in this graphic. And like I mentioned earlier, the Indian Ocean slave trade overlapped in time, period, and region with the transatlantic trade. And you start seeing this in the later stages of the slave trade, where if you look over on this side, the southeastern portion of the map, you're seeing increasing numbers of people being taken from those regions and brought to the Americas. So the main takeaway here is that these migration systems are complex and they're often difficult to tease apart based on historic records alone. So when we're considering the global impacts of the slave trade, I want to further emphasize its modern significance of slave trade research today for members of the African diaspora. So I put this question here: what does the term homeland mean to you? And I put this question here to have us start thinking about origins and where we find our roots. The idea of homeland is a recurring theme in slave trade studies, mainly because of the nature of the slave trade. The intent of enslavement was to strip away the diverse cultural African identities of enslaved people to construct a dehumanized enslaved status. So generations later, that disconnect from the past remains important in thinking about how descendants of enslaved people think about their identities and connect to one another. The idea of the homeland is really important here, as it's something that is very personal and not something that's necessarily clear-cut. So I'll use myself here as an example for how we can think about homeland in a diasporic context. So for me, I could cite the United States as my homeland, given that it's my birthplace and that much of my worldview is likely shaped by growing up and living in the US. Alternatively, I could call Jamaica my homeland, as that's where my relatives on both sides come from and where much of my upbringing and what I know about culture comes from. Or more distantly, I can think about my homeland as Africa. As my family on both sides descends from African enslaved people, I could see myself as rooted in this space because this connection to Africanness has shaped the racial identity I know for myself as a Black person. So I give all these examples to show that none of these answers are necessarily right or wrong, but they show that rather they're complex and how each descendant of slavery is considering identity and home and belonging is important. So in all of these complex considerations about slave trade and identity, my work asks broader questions about biology and lived experiences of enslaved people. Namely, I ask questions like, one, how do burial sites of the enslaved tell us about their relatedness and how they're contributing to the diversity that we see today? Two, how do archival resources help us to identify the ways that enslaved people navigated their landscapes? And lastly, what new information do we get from putting these forms of data together? We saw in the video from an earlier slide that many of the journeys that we have access to were documented by historical data. So my goal here is to use other forms of evidence to place some of these diaspora sites in conversation that usually are not, such as the South Atlantic and the Caribbean, in order to confirm or expand what we already know about the slave trade. And I think that this is an important way of understanding the biocultural contributions that enslaved Africans made to the spaces that they were brought to. I want to mention a few core things that have shaped my research approach, particularly in how it shaped my work in St. Helena. So coming from a US context, there's been a lot of dialogue around respectful treatment of human remains. For the skeletal remains of people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous people, there's a long history of grave robbing, which was used for harmful race science. And some of these skeletons still exist in museums and universities to this day. And in response to that, community advocates have pushed for these institutions to return these remains to their descendants and to stop making these skeletons the subject of research without consent. All of this history and dialogue has prompted me to reflect on the best ways to approach research that involves burials and human remains so that I'm not furthering any of these harms. Another consideration here is the role of communities. Descendant community consultation has become core to any of my research directions. I see communities as having a vested interest in caring for direct or even symbolic kin, and centering communities in any work that I do at burial grounds are necessary to mitigate harm and to co-create knowledge. So my dissertation research included 3 regions of analysis. The first is Barbados, a Caribbean nation known as the birthplace of British slave society. The second is, of course, St. Helena. And the third is Cape Town, South Africa, which is a region that I posit is a space of intersection between the transatlantic and Indian Ocean slave trades. And I say this because some of the Africans that were transported to the Cape originated from the same regions as those who were brought to the Americas. So I use this site as a bit of a bridge between the other 2 sites. And what's important to think about for these 3 sites is that they all were part of the British Empire, which raises questions for me about what differences may exist among them despite their shared colonization system. So now I'll talk a bit about the work I did in St. Helena specifically. And I'll note that this and the next section contain digital images of human remains. So for those of you who I didn't have the pleasure of meeting on the island last year, my work on the island was made possible through collaborations with the St. Helena government, the St. Helena Research Institute and National Trust, the Liberated African Advisory Committee, and the St. Helena Museum, to facilitate respectful and supervised research on some of the individuals known as liberated Africans at Rupert's Valley. I've been in contact with St. Helena stakeholders since 2019, in which I learned more about the site and the island more broadly, and I spoke to people about how my research could be of benefit. I was on the island in spring 2022, conducting the last research project before the reburial of the site occurred in August 2022. So 2 things were important as my research application was under review. One, that any work that I did would not further delay the reburial process for the remains. And 2, that my research would be transparent and yield tangible benefits to the island. So I collaborated with some of the above organizations that I named to co-create some of these benefits. So I'm sure most of you have some level of exposure to the site, but regardless, I'll still give a brief overview of Rupert's Valley so that I can describe where my research fits in this broader context. So like I mentioned before, while I was in St. Helena, my research included collecting data from the Rupert's Valley site, or the Liberated African burial ground. So I placed the term liberated African in quotes because although they were freed in name, the people buried at Rupert's Valley didn't have an opportunity to exercise agency to leave the island or to establish roots, which made the benefits of liberation inaccessible to them. Oh, sorry. So The excavations of the site, as we know, yielded 325 skeletons along with associated artifacts and organic samples. And basically, this was just scraping the surface, as even though 325 were excavated, we know that the site contains an estimated 8,000 skeletons. And a poignant aspect of this site for me was the fact that so many of the people buried there were children, which is a product of the recruitment strategies at the late stages of the slave trade, which were looking for the most vulnerable groups, which often were children. And another part of this site that was very interesting to me was that some of the liberated Africans who were brought to the island did integrate into the St Helena community, roughly 1,000 people. And this means that there are living descendants of some of these liberated Africans on the island today, which I think is a factor that makes this site so important to Saint cultural heritage. And this picture on the left, which you may have seen before, is of 5 of those liberated Africans who survived and integrated into the island community. So my workspace while I was on the island was in the #1 building near the burial site. My work involved 3D scanning cranial remains from adults who were buried at the site to virtually reconstruct them and to assess their levels of biological diversity and to assess how they related to the people buried at the sites in Barbados and Cape Town. And I'll explain these methods in more detail later in the talk. So while I did the scanning, I worked in tandem with teams who were working on the reburial process, and this process was overseen by the National Trust. So whenever I would finish scanning a given individual and documented and took images, I would hand off the box to a person on the reburial team who would proceed with placing all the burial material from that individual into a coffin. And I think that process worked quite well and quite smoothly, as I felt like I was able to meet a lot of members of the community organically that way. And I also felt like I was facilitating rather than posing a barrier to the reburial process. And I'll be transparent in saying that this process was emotional for me at times. Despite having worked with human remains and burials for a long time, being at a site like this every day and seeing so many children represented among the burials was challenging to sit with at times. So to get an idea of what the 3D scanner looks like, let me play this video. The video you're seeing on the left is me scanning an artifact from the burial site. And as you can see, there's a blue device, which is the scanner, set up on a tripod to angle and capture images. And you're seeing it flashing to capture those images. And after it takes these images, it's attached to a turntable, which is turning the object 360 degrees. So it's taking periodic images of each side of the object. And when it's done, the scanner stitches the images together to create a 3D virtual version of the object. And then to the right is an example of one of the scans I did of one of the people, an adult man who was buried at Rupert's Valley. So you can see it captures the color textures and any kinds of interesting information that you would see on the real thing. So in addition to the research I conducted on the island, I did 3 main community engagement initiatives, which included sharing 3D scan data of skeletal remains and burial artifacts, building training opportunities, and beginning a facial approximation project. Although my own research doesn't study artifacts, many of the people I spoke with expressed an interest in having scans of the artifacts created prior to the reburial, potentially for digital curation or 3D printing purposes. So I was able to scan artifacts such as the ones pictured here. And from left to right, you're seeing scans of fragments of a clay pipe, you're seeing a copper bracelet, and an iron tag. Another engagement effort I worked on was contributing to educational opportunities. I was able to put some of my grant funding to support a student intern. The intern was Charlize Henry, who's interested in pursuing a career in archaeology. And she accompanied me to the site on most days, and I had the opportunity to train her in basic skeletal anatomy, 3D scanning, and record keeping. So you can see her formatting a scan in the center picture below. And I now consider her a friend, and I'm looking forward to working with her on her college applications and co-authoring with her on future publications. I also did school visits for elementary and high schoolers while I was on the island. And for the younger kids, I taught them about biological anthropology using group activities and lectures about evolution, primate behavior, forensics, and migration history. And following the school visits, there were several teachers who expressed interest in expanding and revising the current history curriculum on slavery. So I hope to get a collaboration related to that going soon. In early discussions about the project, people expressed the most interest in the artistic estimation of what people buried at Rupert's Valley may have looked like. And so to do so, we selected a man, woman, and child from the site to make these reconstructions. And facial approximation is a rendering that's based on the anatomy, historical context, and artistic interpretation. However, there's going to be limits to what the anatomy can tell you, particularly for things like hairstyle and texture, nose shape, basically anything that's surface level. And I wanted to embrace the interpretive nature of this exercise by creating several versions of each person being reconstructed. So I'm collaborating with several Saint and UK artists to create these portraits. So the project right now includes Sophie Gresswell, Sophia Joshua, Anna Henry, and Kirsten Augustus. And the aim of this project isn't to necessarily create a perfect image of what these people looked like, because I don't think that information will ever be fully available to us. However, I see it as more so a commemoration of the site and the many people who were buried there, while also giving people on the island a say in the outcome and an opportunity to reflect on the site. So just to show you some progress on this project, in the center, you're seeing a playback video of an earlier version of the reconstruction of a child buried at Rupert's Valley. And based on the evidence we have, this child was likely 10 to 12 years old. And the images on the left and right are early reconstructions of what an adult man at the site may have looked like. The left was done by Sophia Joshua, and the right was done by Sophie Gresswell, who's a UK-based professional artist with Saint Ancestry, who did a residency on the island earlier this year. And although this project is still very much ongoing, we're excited to have made progress in creating likenesses that give life to some of these lost stories on the island. And we aim to meet later this month to discuss next steps on editing and creating additional portraits. And I'll wrap up this section by saying that my research on the island was strengthened immensely by the connections I was able to make. Helena Bennett and Shelley Magellan Wade were particularly instrumental in giving me the guidance and resources to do so. And I had the opportunity to do newspaper and radio interviews and public talks while I was here. And I was most excited about participating in a parade float on St. Helena Day as well. So these are all things that were important for me to have a project that was grounded in community feedback. And it's something that will continue to be important for me moving forward. So now I'll discuss my study of biological diversity at enslavement sites. So this study used cranial morphology to assess biological relationships and levels of diversity at 4 archaeological sites. So in terms of their modern value, studies of cranial shape can still tell us a lot about biological relationships. Cranial shape maps on pretty closely to genetic relationships, so it can be considered a non-destructive means of understanding biology and biological connections without having to destroy any of the skeletal material. Given past unethical approaches to cranial studies and studies with human remains, which I mentioned earlier in the talk, care should really be taken when conducting this kind of study. And at its best, it's done with an awareness that human variation doesn't follow strict boundaries of racial categories. And with all of that being said, the questions that I asked in this study were, one, which groups were the most closely related and which were the most diverse? And two, do these patterns show evidence of subgrouping, which means do these larger groups contain smaller, distinct biological groups within them? So like I mentioned, I included 4 archaeological sites in this analysis, the St Helena site, Fort Knock, which is the site of a shipwreck of a slave ship in the Bay of Cape Town, various localities within colonial Cape Town, and Newton Plantation in Barbados. Of these sites, the Rupert's Valley site is the latest dated in roughly the 1840s. And the sample size included 85 adult individuals. So as you can see, many of the individuals included in this study had fragmentary skeletal preservation, meaning that they weren't all put together. Some of them were quite broken. So prior to collecting data, I virtually reconstructed these fragments, which you can see happening in this clip here. And once I finished these reconstructions, I would merge all the fragments together into one scan to use for a data collection. And then once I did that, I collected 3D landmark data from the surface of the cranium to assess the overall shape and to use that to quantify diversity and biological patterns in the data set. So what you're looking at here is an example of a data collection trial for one of the people buried at Rupert's Valley. And the points in red is showing all the landmarks that I collected. And I want to emphasize here that the aim here was not to categorize patterns of shape by any racial means, but rather to estimate how the groups related to one another and to assess their levels of diversity. So I used what is called a geometric morphometric approach to analyze the data. And basically that just means that it standardizes the data for analysis. And in terms of the tests I ran a principal components analysis, which is a test that takes large data sets and reduces them to decipherable units of variation that are called principal components. And from these principal components, you can identify general patterns of variation in the data. I also ran an analysis of variance test to test group differences and levels of diversity. And lastly, I used cluster analysis to identify subgroups in and across each site. So for the results, you're looking at a scatter plot for the principal components analysis. So these axes show principal component 1 and 2, and I chose these axes because they make up the highest percentage of the variation in the sample. So to walk through each sample group, we have the St. Helena group here in blue. We have urban Cape Town in orange, the Cape Town shipwreck site in lavender, and Barbados in light blue. So in the plot, each point represents one person, and the points that are closer together can be interpreted as being more closely related. So you can see that there's clear overlap between all these groups, and that makes sense given the overlapping migration histories that a lot of them share. However, there seems to be some level of group separation. And you can see that especially between the Barbados and Cape Town shipwreck sites along PC2. So from this plot alone, it does seem like the groups are quite diverse, but I wanted to tease this apart a bit further. So based on the analysis of variance test, it showed that the effect of group on cranial shape was significant, and we should interpret that as meaning that the groups were biologically distinct. And in terms of levels of diversity, the Cape Town shipwreck and Barbados groups had the highest levels of diversity. However, these values were not statistically significant, so we should take that result with a grain of salt. And in terms of how the groups relate to one another, St. Helena was most closely related to the urban Cape Town group. Now, walk with me here, because this is a little bit more complex. So what you're looking at is the results of the cluster analysis, which was showing the ways that the members of each group were sorted and in what proportions. I want to highlight the Cape Town shipwreck site here. So we can see that it was overwhelmingly assigned to cluster 3 in blue. So why is this? Well, prior studies of the Cape Town shipwreck site at Fort Knox determined that the victims of this shipwreck were most likely of Mozambique origin. And you can see that this cluster is represented in the other 3 groups as well, which suggests that Mozambique, or more broadly, other Southeastern African groups, may be contributing to these other 3 sites as well. So to revisit the questions that I posed in this study, I asked, 1, which groups were most closely related and which were the most diverse? And is there evidence of subgroups that you're seeing in these sample groups? So to the first question, the groups were all distinct from one another, which reflects their differences in migration history. However, there was a lot of overlap among them, meaning that they were still connected and they weren't exclusive groups. The urban Cape Town site was most closely related to the St Helena site, and the Cape Town shipwreck sites in the Barbados groups had the highest levels of within-group diversity. For the answer to the second question, it seems to be yes. So in interpreting what this means, when people from a high diversity region like the African continent are moved to a smaller location, let's take Barbados as an example, the tendency would be for the biological diversity to go down as a result of there being a smaller gene pool, less people, less opportunities to form families. However, that doesn't seem to be reflected in the results that we have here. Rather, what we're seeing is that there's a presence of subgroups, which suggests some degree of stratification. And what stratification means here is that there were social or legal barriers in these spaces that restricted who enslaved people were able to interact or form families with. And when that is in place, that leads to pockets of smaller, distinct subgroups that maintain high levels of diversity of themselves. So you see these distinct groups to some extent in all 4 of these groups, including the St. Helena group. Another important takeaway here is the influence of Southeastern Africa in these groups. The blue cluster, again, which likely represents Southeastern African origin, was present in all 4 of these groups, which suggests that contributions from this region may be higher than expected based on traditional migration records, particularly for Barbados, which usually isn't associated with Southeastern African origin. And now I'll switch gears a bit and discuss some of the results of my analyses of archival data. So this study used thematic analysis to analyze archival resources that described enslaved people. So this study asked the following questions. The first being, what are important features of enslaved people's social positioning and experiences in 19th century documents? And 2, do these representations differ between enslaved and recaptive status? The second question is motivated by the nature of the sample, which included documents from Barbados, St. Helena, and Cape Town. Of the 3 groups, the St. Helena sample represented recaptive status, which is this in-between space of not being formally enslaved, but still having heavily reduced agency. So again, that would be what we would call the liberated Africans. They can also be referred to as recaptives. The sample for this study included 2 types of documents. For the Barbados and Cape Town datasets, this included fugitive slave advertisements. These ads are typically in the format that you're seeing on the right side of the screen. They're roughly a paragraph in length, written by an enslaver who's hoping to identify an enslaved person who has escaped. Although this is clearly a biased data set, as it only includes enslavers' perspectives, these ads often describe enslaved people in much detail, such as their physical characteristics, their behavior, their social networks. So all of these things make it a useful resource for understanding how runaways were perceived and treated. In contrast, for the St. Helena sample, the documents that I included in this study were written by Europeans who observed or worked at the Liberated African depot. And usually these documents described the horrors of the slave trade or categorized the African groups represented there. One key and necessary part of engaging with this kind of data set is to read against the grain. I included a quote from Dr. Sadia Hartman here that reads, quote, "Writing the history of the dominated requires not only the interrogation of dominant narratives and the exposure of their contingent and partisan character, but also the reclamation of archival material for contrary purposes." And I think that this quote beautifully captures the spirit of how we need to have a really solid understanding of these structures of colonialism and enslavement and the attitudes and perceptions permeating throughout to be able to adequately deconstruct it. To analyze patterns in the data, I used what's called thematic analysis, which is a technique of systematically tagging pieces of text data that represent patterns in the data set. And these are referred to as codes. And then these codes are put together to identify broad themes that are important in the data. So in this process, I made a code book that essentially standardized what to code and when in the data. And I would alter it as I saw new details show up in the data set and modify my code book as needed. I performed this analysis in software called MaxQDA. This software allows for qualitative analysis of large text data sets. And you're seeing an example of the interface of the software here, where the text is in the window on the right, and the codes that I use to tag the text are running in the column on the left. To analyze the text further, I used measures such as word frequencies and visualization tools to assess connections between these codes. And lastly, I used the strategy of metacoding, which basically is the creation of a matrix of all the documents and all the codes to facilitate comparison across sites. So in this case, I was comparing across Barbados, St. Helena, and Cape Town. So for the sake of time, I can't share all of the results of this study, but I've selected 3 themes in the data sets that I wanted to highlight. So first, the documents in the Cape Town and Barbados samples were fugitive slave advertisements, and both samples discussed an aspect of putting on an act. An act here refers to the strategies that runaways would use to stay hidden, which was based on a careful balance of recognizing features that were beyond their control, such as language, their ability to pass as another group, and then adapting these features to controlled performances to their advantage. In the Barbados context, these described acts were more elaborate, where a runaway would be described as using disguises or feigning certain skills. For example, one advertisement describes a runaway named Richard, who was, quote, "seen dressed like a sailor in blue jacket and trousers and a black wig on, offering himself to the commander of a merchantman to be his steward. He's naturally a most specious fellow and fully qualified by art to set up to any character he assumes," end quote. So this is an AI-generated image, so it's of course not meant to be an accurate or perfect image of Richard, but I included it here to represent what the advertisement is trying to evoke. The ad describes Richard's acts as highly deceptive and likely something that will keep happening. And it implies that Richard had the capacity to influence others around him. References to an act in the Cape context focus more on the role of resemblance. So for example, some runaways were described as resembling a Hottentot, which is a pejorative term for the indigenous Khoikhoi, which is a class that was also heavily oppressed under Cape colonization practices, but they weren't formally enslaved. Although the St Helena sample did not represent this traditional idea of an act, there were some instances of escape that were happening for the liberated Africans, where some of them would escape to mountainous areas of the island out of a refusal for coercive labor. An important theme in all three of the data sets was violence. The use of the term specter here, when I say specters of violence, is to show the hidden part of that violence. In the Barbados and Cape Town samples, we see descriptions of burns, scars, limps, and so on that are related to punishment and labor. The hidden aspect was the person carrying out the violence, which is a testament to how normalized it was in these societies. In contrast, the St. Helena sample was dated to a period where the British Empire was fighting the slave trade and incorporating former slaves into the British Empire. So those texts actually did not shy away from naming the actors who were responsible for the violence, who at the time were mainly Portuguese slave traders. The specter of violence in the St. Helena case is related to death, as it was so commonplace both on slave ships and at the liberated African holding spaces. And lastly, racial classification systems were important themes in all three groups. While St. Helena and the Cape both frequently described particular African origins among the people at these sites, such as being from Mozambique or Angola and so on, Barbados and St. Helena had the most similar racial system in terms of the language and how they were distinguishing between people. And they would use generalizing terms such as the word Negro, for example, to refer to not only appearance, but also ways of life and ascribed inferior status. The Cape data set was a bit different. And this is likely a consequence of its multi-ethnic history, where not only Africans were enslaved, but also South and Southeast Asians. And there was also a large mixed race population present. Thus, they still used racializing terminology such as prize Negro or Hottentot, but more commonly, they would default to descriptions of birthplace and resemblance in order to identify people. So to sum up, this study was asking what parts of enslaved persons' experiences were salient in these 19th century texts, and two, are these modes of description different between enslaved people and liberated Africans? So to the first question, some of the most salient themes across the groups were using biological features like appearance as a way to infer their value and capabilities. Some enslaved and recaptive people used these distortions to their advantage, such as with performing in certain ways to successfully escape and remain hidden. And for the second question, the answer seems to be yes. The description of liberated Africans represents an in-between, where they weren't actively enslaved, but they were still viewed as inferior. They were also seen as undergoing a transformation from the degraded state that they were in, from the British view, towards being useful to the British Empire's emerging apprenticeship labor system. So the restrictions of the island limited opportunities for escape or asserting agency, but liberated Africans still found ways to forge community, refuse coercion, and even start families in some cases in this space. So broadly, the results from both the biological and the archival studies suggest that the racialized colonial systems of this era occurred alongside and likely impacted the biological consequences, in that ideas of certain groups of people possessing certain value could have had consequences for where they were transported to and how they were treated. Thus, viewing these types of data together is useful to see the full ramifications of their experiences of where enslaved persons lived, died, and were transported to. And for some more specific takeaways here, firstly, the idea that Southeastern African biological contributions to diaspora groups is more salient, more important than would be expected from traditional historical data, particularly in spaces like Barbados. Secondly, that St Helena shows close biological relationships with colonial Cape Town. Third, that archival descriptions of late slave trade era sites still rely on explicit modes of racializing language, wherein descriptions of appearance and behavior are used to reinforce these racial systems and hierarchies. And lastly, the St Helena archival descriptions of the liberated Africans show evaluations of liberated Africans' value in the emerging British apprenticeship labor system. And now I'll wrap up by discussing some next steps for my work quickly. So firstly, I'm excited to share that the full version of my dissertation is available for anyone to read on ProQuest for free. Admittedly, though, it's quite dense, so keep that in mind if you decide to embark on that or to read it. However, it does have all of the details on my findings and interpretations, so it may be of interest. I'll also shortly receive hard copies of my dissertation, and once I do, I'll send some copies to the island for your own records. In case you're interested in accessing it, I've included a QR code here that links to the page, which if you have a smartphone and use the camera on your phone to zoom in on the code, a link would pop up. And then it would pull up the page that you're seeing on the right. But alternatively, I've also shared the PDF of the dissertation in the St. Helena News Facebook group, so it can be accessed that way as well. So my research website, which is just my name, AndreanaCunningham.com, will also soon feature blurbs about my dissertation research that use accessible language to summarize the main findings of my research in more detail. And when that is available, it'll be located where you see the red outline under the research tab, and I'll circulate this publicly when it's live. And I also will have a community newsletter in development if there's interest. And this will be a letter where any community members can add their email to subscribe to a mailing list, and I'll send periodic updates on more work relating to St. Helena, any publications or future findings. And this feature will be made available on the website as well. And lastly, just to briefly touch on some ongoing and future projects in the near future. As I mentioned, the facial approximation project is still ongoing, so stay tuned for updates on that. I also want to kickstart the collaborations with educator units on the island to work on expanding and revising history curricula to accommodate some of my own research findings and more recent ideas of framing diaspora that would be helpful for the history curriculum on the island. I also want to work towards facilitating visiting scholars or students now that I am housed at Boston University. I think that this is a really prime opportunity to facilitate ways that my work and my presence on the island can be a benefit to folks on the island and potentially be a training opportunity. And lastly, I want to continue to work with the National Trust and other island stakeholders to work towards amassing funding for commemoration of the Rupert Valley site. So that's ongoing as well. So lastly, I welcome any feedback at any time. My email is ascu@bu.edu. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or feedback, concerns, anything like that. I'm always happy to hear from you. And lastly, I would just like to thank my funding sources at the National Science Foundation and UF for funding this dissertation project, as well as my collaborators in Barbados and at Auburn University, as well as the many St. Helenian institutions and people that have supported my work and made it better. And I'm also very thankful to you all for being here today and for listening. And I am looking forward to taking any questions you may have. So I'll stop here and open up for any questions. Thank you.